In the hill country of Ephraim, where ancient olive groves cast their silver-green shadows across terraced slopes, and the morning mist clung to valleys carved by countless generations, there dwelt a love that would reshape the destiny of Israel. The air in these highlands carried the scent of wild herbs and the distant memory of patriarchs who had walked these paths, their footsteps worn into the very stones that marked the way to Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord had found its resting place. Here, in the town of Ramah, lived a man named Elkanah, righteous in his ways and faithful in his worship of the Almighty. His house stood among the other dwellings of his kinsmen, built of the local stone that caught the light of dawn and held it through the day, releasing its warmth as the sun surrendered to evening. The sounds of daily life echoed through these streets, the lowing of cattle returning from pasture, the voices of women drawing water from the well, the laughter of children playing in the dust, and always, threading through it all, the gentle bleating of sheep and goats that were the wealth and pride of every household. Yet, in this place of apparent blessing and contentment, there dwelt a sorrow so deep and abiding that it had worn grooves in the heart of one woman, like water wearing channels in stone. Hannah, beloved wife of Elkanah, carried within her soul an emptiness that no earthly comfort could fill, the hollow ache of barrenness that marked her as one set apart, not by divine favor, but by what seemed to be divine silence. The very name Hannah meant grace or favor, yet she walked through her days feeling marked by neither. In a culture where a woman's worth was measured by the children she bore, where motherhood was seen as the clearest sign of God's blessing, Hannah moved like a shadow through her own life, loved by her husband but tormented by her rival, blessed with material comfort but haunted by spiritual emptiness. As the seasons turned and the annual pilgrimage to Shiloh approached once again, Hannah prepared her heart for another journey to the house of the Lord. Little did she know that this year would mark not an end to her sorrow, but a transformation of it, that her deepest pain would become the birthplace of her greatest gift to the world, and that her tears, falling like rain upon the parched ground of her soul, would water the roots of prophecy itself. The story that unfolds in these ancient hills speaks to the heart of every soul who has ever wrestled with unanswered prayer, who has wondered at the silence of heaven, who has dared to hope against hope, that God sees, God knows, and God remembers, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. It is the story of a mother's love that would give birth to a prophet, of a woman's surrender that would shape a nation, and of a prayer so pure and desperate that it would echo through the corridors of eternity itself. Elkanah was a man of substance and standing in his community, one who feared the Lord and walked in the ways of his fathers. His lineage traced back through the Levitical families, those chosen servants of the Most High who had been set apart for sacred duties. Though he was not himself a priest, the blood of those who served before the altar flowed in his veins, and he carried himself with the dignity and reverence that marked the truly devout. His home reflected both his prosperity and his piety. The main dwelling was built around a central courtyard where a fig tree provided shade and the sound of water from a small cistern created a peaceful atmosphere for contemplation. The rooms were simple but well appointed, with oil lamps of bronze and pottery vessels crafted by skilled artisans. Woven carpets covered the earthen floors, and the walls bore the marks of careful maintenance that spoke of a household where order and cleanliness were valued as reflections of spiritual discipline. Elkanah had taken 2 wives, as was the custom and right of a man of his standing. Peninnah, whose name meant pearl or coral, had proven fruitful in her marriage, bearing children who filled the house with their voices and brought joy to their father's heart. Her sons played in the courtyard, their laughter echoing off the stone walls, while her daughters helped with the daily tasks that kept a household running smoothly. She was a woman of practical gifts, skilled in the arts of weaving and cooking, capable in her management of servants and resources. But it was Hannah whom Elkanah loved with the deeper love, the love that goes beyond duty or convenience to touch the very essence of the soul. She moved through their home with a grace that was both natural and learned through suffering. Her beauty was not merely physical, though she was indeed fair to look upon, but arose from an inner quality that drew people to her, a gentleness, a depth of understanding, a capacity for joy that made her occasional laughter all the more precious because it was earned through tears. Hannah's days were filled with the countless tasks that fell to women in that time and place. She rose before dawn to kindle the fire and prepare the morning meal, grinding grain between stones worn smooth by generations of use. Her hands, roughened by work but still graceful in their movements, shaped bread and stirred pots, wove cloth and mended garments. She supervised the servant girls, taught them skills and virtues, and maintained the harmonious rhythm that made their household a place of peace. Yet always, threading through every activity like a silent melody, was the awareness of what was missing. When she prepared food, she thought of the children she might have fed. When she wove cloth, she imagined the small garments she might have made. When evening fell and Elkanah returned from his business in the town, she listened for the sound of running feet that would never come, the voices calling "Mother" that would never be heard in her courtyard. The other women of Ramah treated her with a complex mixture of sympathy and discomfort. They pitied her barrenness, but feared it as well, as if it might somehow be contagious. When they gathered at the well to draw water and share the news of the day, their conversations would often turn to their children, their triumphs and troubles, their growth and development. Hannah would listen with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, offering advice when asked, celebrating the joys of others, while her own heart remained locked in winter. It was Peninnah who proved the most difficult burden to bear, not because she was actively cruel, though her words could cut like a blade when she chose, but because her very presence in the household was a daily reminder of Hannah's failure. Peninnah's children called Elkanah "father" with easy familiarity, climbed upon his lap when he returned from journeys, and filled his eyes with pride when they displayed some new skill or repeated some clever saying. Hannah watched these interactions with a heart torn between love and longing. She genuinely cared for Peninnah's children, had helped raise them and teach them, but every moment of affection they shared with their father was a moment that highlighted her own emptiness. When the little ones skinned their knees and ran crying to their mothers, when they fell asleep in their parents' arms, when they grew and changed and became more fully themselves with each passing day, Hannah saw not just their development, but her own deprivation. Peninnah, for her part, seemed to understand her power in this situation and was not always gracious in its use. She had given Elkanah children, had fulfilled the primary purpose for which women married, and she never let Hannah forget it. Her taunts were not always open. Sometimes they came disguised as concern, as offers to help, as expressions of hope that perhaps this year would be different. But Hannah knew the poison hidden in these honey-sweet words, felt the sting of each seemingly innocent comment about maternal duties or the joys of motherhood. "Perhaps," Peninnah would say while watching Hannah work, "if you spent more time in prayer instead of weaving, the Almighty might see fit to open your womb." Or she might comment while her own children played nearby, "It must be restful to have so much quiet in the house. I sometimes envy you the peace." Each word was carefully chosen to wound, to remind, to diminish. Hannah bore these afflictions with a patience that was both natural to her character and learned through years of practice. She had discovered that responding to Peninnah's provocations only escalated the conflict and brought distress to the entire household. Better to absorb the hurt in silence, to offer no target for further assault, to maintain the dignity that was perhaps the only treasure no one could take from her. But the silence that protected her from her rival also isolated her from potential comfort. She could not speak of her pain to the other women of the town, for they were either mothers themselves who could not truly understand, or fellow sufferers whose own wounds were too raw to allow them to help heal hers. She could not burden Elkanah with the full weight of her sorrow, for he loved her and was already doing everything within his power to comfort her. She could not rail against God, for she had been taught from childhood that such rebellion was both futile and sinful. So Hannah carried her grief like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold, present with every breath, but acknowledged only in the deep hours of the night when sleep fled and she lay listening to the sounds of the household around her. Elkanah's steady breathing, the rustle of Peninnah's children settling in their beds, the distant call of night birds in the olive groves beyond the town. In these lonely hours, Hannah would sometimes slip from her bed and make her way to the flat roof of the house, where she could look up at the stars and feel, if not comfort, then at least a connection to something vast and eternal. The Almighty, who had set those lights in their courses, surely knew her heart, surely saw her tears even when they fell unseen by human eyes. But the stars, for all their beauty, offered no answers to her questions, no relief from her longing, no promise that her suffering would ever end. The seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, marked by the festivals and observances that gave structure to Hebrew life. Spring brought Passover, with its remembrance of deliverance and its celebration of new life appearing throughout the land. Summer brought the Festival of Weeks, when the first fruits were offered to the Lord in thanksgiving for his provision. Autumn brought the solemn days of atonement and the joyous festival of booths, when families lived in temporary shelters to remember their ancestors' journey through the wilderness. But for Hannah, the most significant season was not marked by any single festival, but by the annual pilgrimage that her family made to Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord had been established, and where the Ark of the Covenant dwelt in the Holy of Holies. This journey, which should have been a source of spiritual refreshment and communal joy, had become instead an annual ordeal that she both anticipated and dreaded. The preparations for the pilgrimage began weeks in advance. Elkanah would arrange his business affairs to allow for the absence, storing up goods that could be traded or sold along the way to cover the family's expenses. The women would prepare the special foods required for the journey and the festival, grinding extra flour and pressing oil that would be needed for offerings. Clothing would be mended and cleaned, for one must appear before the Lord in garments that reflected both respect and joy. For Hannah, these preparations carried an additional weight of meaning. Each year, she approached the pilgrimage with a mixture of hope and desperation that had grown more intense with time. Perhaps this year would be different. Perhaps this year, when she stood before the tabernacle and poured out her heart to the Almighty, he would finally hear and answer her prayer. Perhaps this year would mark the end of her barrenness and the beginning of the life she had always dreamed of living. But each year, the pilgrimage would end and the family would return to Ramah, and Hannah would find herself still empty, still waiting, still wondering if God had forgotten her completely. The journey to Shiloh took the better part of 2 days, following ancient paths that wound through the hill country of Ephraim. The family traveled as part of a larger group of pilgrims from their region, finding safety and companionship in numbers. The men walked alongside the donkeys that carried their supplies, while the women and children often rode or walked as the terrain and their energy permitted. Elkanah was a man of generous spirit, and he ensured that his family traveled in comfort befitting their station. Hannah rode a gentle donkey whose steady gait allowed her to observe the changing landscape as they made their way toward the holy place. The olive groves gave way to wilder country, where ancient oaks provided shelter for flocks of sheep and goats tended by solitary shepherds. Streams ran clear and cold from the heights, creating green valleys where flowers bloomed in season and birds nested in the reedy margins. The conversations among the pilgrims were animated and joyful, filled with anticipation of the worship they would soon offer and the fellowship they would enjoy with families and friends from other parts of the land. Children ran alongside the caravan when the path permitted, their excitement infectious and their laughter a constant soundtrack to the journey. Even the adults seemed to shed some of their everyday concerns as they drew closer to the place where heaven and earth met in the tabernacle of the Most High. Hannah participated in these conversations and shared in the general atmosphere of celebration, but part of her remained always separate, observing from a distance that was more emotional than physical. She could smile at the children's antics and contribute to discussions about the upcoming festival, but she could not fully enter into the joy that seemed to come so naturally to the other women, many of whom were bringing their own children to present before the Lord or to fulfill vows made in previous years. Peninnah, traveling with her children clustered around her like chicks around a hen, seemed to bloom in the communal atmosphere. Her natural confidence was enhanced by the presence of her offspring, who provided her with endless topics of conversation and sources of pride. She would point out landmarks to them, tell them stories of previous pilgrimages, and prepare them for the wonders they would soon witness in the tabernacle. "See that hill there?" she might say to one of her sons, her voice carrying clearly to where Hannah rode nearby. "That's where your father and I came on our first pilgrimage together, before you were born. How the Lord has blessed us since then." The words were innocent enough on the surface, but Hannah heard in them the familiar note of triumph, the subtle reminder of all that Peninnah possessed and Hannah lacked. As they crested the final hill and the settlement of Shiloh came into view below them, a hush fell over the pilgrims. There, rising from the center of the town like a jewel set in its proper mounting, stood the tabernacle of the Lord, not the portable structure that had accompanied the Israelites through their wilderness wanderings, but a more permanent installation that had been their spiritual center for generations. The sight never failed to move Hannah, no matter how many times she had seen it. The white curtains gleamed in the sunlight, the bronze altar sent up its pillar of smoke from the sacrifices offered there, and the whole complex seemed to radiate a sense of the divine presence that dwelt within. This was the place where the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had chosen to make his dwelling among his people. This was where prayers rose like incense before the throne of the Almighty. This was where miracles could happen, where the impossible could become possible, where a barren woman might find hope. The pilgrims made their way down into the town, seeking lodgings and preparing for the days of worship that lay ahead. Shiloh during festival times was a bustling place, filled with temporary camps and crowded markets where pilgrims could purchase animals for sacrifice or other necessities they might have forgotten to bring. The air rang with multiple dialects of Hebrew as families from different regions encountered one another and renewed friendships formed in previous years. Elkanah secured accommodations for his family in a house belonging to distant relatives, as was customary. The rooms were simple but clean, providing a base from which they could participate in the festival activities. Their first priority, as always, was to present themselves before the Lord and offer the sacrifices appropriate to their station and their needs. The family made their way to the tabernacle complex as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. The bronze altar dominated the outer court, its surface blackened by countless offerings and its base stained with the blood of sacrificial animals. The laver stood nearby, its polished surface reflecting the light as the priests performed the ritual washings required by the law. Beyond these furnishings, the tabernacle proper rose in majestic simplicity, its entrance guarded by embroidered curtains that concealed the holy place from profane eyes. Eli the priest, already advanced in years but still vigorous in his service, oversaw the activities with the practiced eye of one who had performed these rituals countless times. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, assisted him, though even a casual observer might note that their manner lacked the reverence that should characterize those who served before the Lord. They went through the motions of their duties with an efficiency that spoke more of routine than of worship, and their eyes held a hardness that seemed inappropriate for men charged with mediating between God and His people. Hannah watched the preparations for sacrifice with the intense attention of one who had come not as a mere observer, but as a supplicant. She had brought her own offering, not the required animal sacrifice, which was Elkanah's responsibility as head of the household, but the more intangible offering of her broken heart and desperate need. She stood among the other worshippers, her lips moving in silent prayer, her eyes fixed on the altar where the smoke of burning offerings rose toward heaven. When Elkanah's sacrifice was offered and consumed by the sacred fire, the family joined in the communal meal that followed. This was always a time of celebration, when the portions of the sacrificial animal not burned on the altar were cooked and shared among the worshippers. It was a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, a reminder that God desired not merely obedience, but fellowship with His people. Elkanah, in his love for Hannah and his desire to comfort her, always gave her a double portion of the sacrificial meal. This gesture, meant kindly, had the effect of drawing attention to her barrenness rather than alleviating it. The other worshippers would notice his special consideration and remember why it was necessary. Some would nod in understanding and sympathy, while others would whisper among themselves about the mysterious ways of the Almighty, and why some women were blessed with children, while others were not. Peninnah, never one to miss an opportunity to assert her superiority, would make sure that Hannah's special portion did not go unnoticed or unremarked. "How generous our husband is," she might say, her voice pitched to carry to nearby families. Of course, Hannah needs the extra nourishment. She works so hard maintaining our household, with no little ones to help her or distract her from her duties. The words were carefully chosen to sound solicitous, while actually emphasizing Hannah's childless state. Hannah accepted both the portion and the attention with as much grace as she could manage, but each year the ritual became more difficult to bear. The food, however carefully prepared and lovingly given, seemed to turn to ashes in her mouth. The conversations swirling around her were filled with talk of children and families, with mothers comparing their offspring and fathers expressing pride in their sons' growth and daughters' accomplishments. As the evening meal concluded and the families began to disperse to their lodgings, Hannah found herself overwhelmed by a familiar despair that seemed to intensify in this holy place rather than diminish. Surrounded by evidence of God's blessing on so many others, her own emptiness felt more acute than ever. The joy of the other worshippers, the satisfaction of fulfilled ritual obligations, the sense of communion with the divine that she saw reflected in their faces, all of this served to highlight her own spiritual drought. Unable to bear the thought of returning to their lodgings and continuing the pretense of celebration, Hannah slipped away from the family group and made her way back toward the tabernacle. The evening sacrifices had been offered, and the complex had grown quieter, though it never completely emptied of worshippers and seekers who came to pray at all hours of the day and night. The moon had risen full and bright, casting silver light over the sacred precincts and creating deep shadows between the tent posts and hanging curtains. Hannah found herself drawn to a spot near the entrance to the holy place, where she could look toward the inner sanctuary and feel as close as possible to the presence of the Almighty without violating the boundaries that marked the limit of lay access to the sacred space. Here, in the relative solitude and silence of the night-wrapped tabernacle, Hannah finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her sorrow. The tears she had held back during the day came flooding forth like water from a broken dam, and her carefully maintained composure crumbled completely. She wept not just for the children she had never borne, but for the dreams that had died year after year, for the hope that had been deferred until it made her heart sick, for the growing certainty that God had turned his face away from her and would never answer her prayers. As she wept, Hannah began to speak, not in the formal language of public prayer, but in the raw, desperate words that came from the deepest places of her heart. She spoke to God as she had never spoken before, holding nothing back, laying bare every emotion and every need, pouring out her soul like water before the one who had created her and who alone could heal her brokenness. "O Lord of hosts," she whispered through her tears, "if you will indeed look upon the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." The words came from the deepest wellspring of her being, expressing not just her longing for a child, but her willingness to surrender that child completely to God's service. She was offering to become a mother only to give up motherhood, to receive the gift she had always wanted, only to place it immediately on the altar of sacrifice. It was a prayer that revealed the full measure of her faith and her desperation. Faith that God could still work miracles, desperation that drove her to promise anything if only her prayers might finally be answered. Hannah prayed with an intensity that seemed to consume her entire being. Her lips moved rapidly, but made no sound that could be distinguished from the night wind rustling through the tabernacle curtains. Her body swayed slightly, as if buffeted by invisible forces, and her hands clutched at her garments as if she were drowning and grasping for something solid to hold on to. She was oblivious to her surroundings, unaware of anything beyond the urgent need to pour out her heart to God and the desperate hope that this time, finally, he would hear and respond. It was in this state of complete abandonment to prayer that Eli the priest found her. He had been making his evening rounds, checking on the sacred fire and ensuring that all was in order for the night watches, when he noticed the figure of a woman near the entrance to the tabernacle. At first he thought she might be ill or distressed by some physical ailment, but as he drew closer and observed her more carefully, his interpretation of her behavior took a different and less charitable turn. Eli had grown old in the service of the tabernacle, and his years had not been kind to his faith or his character. The corruption of his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had infected the entire priesthood, and the spiritual decline of Israel's religious leadership had left its mark on Eli himself. He had seen too many pilgrims who came to the tabernacle not to worship, but to carouse, who used the religious festivals as opportunities for indulgence rather than reverence. His eyes had grown cynical, his judgment hasty, and his compassion diminished by repeated disappointment in human nature. Looking at Hannah swaying in her intense prayer, seeing her lips moving without audible words, observing her obvious emotional distress, Eli jumped to the conclusion that she was intoxicated. It was not uncommon for pilgrims to overindulge in the wine that was part of the festival celebrations, and he had dealt with many such cases over the years. His response was swift and condemnatory, lacking any attempt to understand or investigate before passing judgment. "How long will you go on being drunk?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of his office and the irritation of a man who thought he was dealing with a familiar problem. "Put away your wine from you." The words struck Hannah like physical blows, jerking her from the depths of communion with God back to the harsh reality of human misunderstanding. She looked up at the priest through her tears, seeing in his face not compassion or wisdom, but accusation and disgust. The irony was bitter beyond bearing. She who had come seeking God's blessing was being accused of behavior that would have made her unfit to approach the holy place at all. For a moment, Hannah was too shocked to respond. She had poured out her heart in the most sincere prayer of her life, had offered God everything she had to give, had reached the very limits of human desperation and faith, only to be misunderstood and condemned by the very man who was supposed to mediate between her and the Almighty. The injustice of it was overwhelming, adding insult to the injury of years of unanswered prayer. But Hannah was not a woman to be crushed by misunderstanding, however hurtful. She had learned through long suffering to maintain her dignity even in the face of false accusation, and she drew upon that strength now. Rising to her full height and wiping the tears from her face, she addressed Eli with a calm that was more impressive for being so hard won. "No, my lord," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning within her. "I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." Her words carried such obvious sincerity, such transparent pain, that they penetrated even Eli's cynicism and reached whatever remained of his priestly compassion. He looked at her more carefully, seeing not the signs of intoxication he had assumed were there, but the marks of genuine spiritual anguish. Her clothing was modest and appropriate, her bearing dignified despite her tears, her speech articulate and respectful. This was clearly not a woman who had come to the tabernacle for frivolous or irreverent purposes. As the truth of the situation became clear to him, Eli felt a stirring of the prophetic gift that had been dormant within him for so long that he had almost forgotten it existed. Looking at this woman who had suffered so much and prayed so fervently, he sensed that her petition had indeed been heard by the Almighty, and that his role was not to judge, but to confirm and bless. "Go in peace," Eli said, his voice now gentle and filled with an authority that came not from his office, but from divine inspiration. "And may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." The words fell upon Hannah's spirit, like rain upon parched ground. After years of silence from heaven, after countless prayers that seemed to disappear into the void, after this very night's desperate plea that had been met first with misunderstanding and accusation, she was finally hearing words of hope and promise. The priest's benediction carried with it the weight of prophetic certainty, the assurance that her prayer had not only been heard, but would be answered. Hannah felt something within her spirit shift and settle, like a bone that had been out of joint finally sliding back into its proper place. The desperation that had driven her to the tabernacle began to transform into something else. Not yet joy, for the fulfillment was still in the future, but a deep peace that comes when one knows beyond all doubt that God has heard and will respond in His perfect timing. "Let your servant find favor in your eyes," she replied to Eli, her voice now carrying a lightness that had been absent for years. She bowed respectfully to the priest and turned to leave, but her steps were no longer those of a woman weighed down by sorrow. There was a spring in her gait that spoke of hope renewed and faith vindicated. As Hannah made her way back to their lodgings, she felt as if she were seeing the world with new eyes. The moonlight that had seemed cold and distant when she first approached the tabernacle now appeared warm and welcoming, illuminating her path with gentle silver radiance. The sounds of the night, the soft conversations of pilgrims settling in for sleep, the lowing of cattle in their enclosures, the distant call of night birds, all seemed to form a symphony of peace that matched the harmony she felt within her own soul. When she rejoined her family, the change in her demeanor was immediately apparent to everyone present. The drawn look that had marked her features throughout the journey and the early part of their stay in Shiloh had been replaced by an expression of serene confidence that puzzled her companions. Even Peninnah, usually so quick to notice and comment on Hannah's moods, seemed uncertain how to respond to this transformation. Elkanah, who knew his beloved wife better than anyone, saw the change and rejoiced in it, even though he did not understand its source. He had watched Hannah's pain increase year by year, had felt helpless in the face of her sorrow, and had prayed many times that somehow her burden might be lifted. Now, looking at her face, he saw something that had been missing for so long that he had almost forgotten it existed: hope. "Hannah," he said softly, taking her hand in his, "you seem different. Has something happened?" Hannah smiled at her husband, and he noticed that this was not the careful, constructed smile she had worn for so many years, but something genuine and spontaneous. "I have been praying," she said simply, "and the Lord has heard my prayer." She did not elaborate on the encounter with Eli or the specific nature of the divine assurance she had received. Some experiences were too sacred to be shared immediately, too precious to be subjected to the questions and potential doubt of others. Hannah held this promise close to her heart like a treasure, protecting it and nurturing it, as she would soon nurture the child who would fulfill it. The remainder of their time in Shiloh passed in an atmosphere of celebration that Hannah could finally share authentically. She participated in the festival activities with genuine joy, offered her prayers with confidence rather than desperation, and joined in the conversations with other families without the underlying sadness that had characterized her participation in previous years. On the final morning of their stay, as the family prepared to begin the journey back to Ramah, Hannah took one last look at the tabernacle where her life had been transformed. The morning sun was painting the sacred complex in shades of gold and crimson, and the smoke from the first sacrifices of the day was rising straight up into the still air like a visible connection between earth and heaven. "Thank you," she whispered, her words directed not to the building, but to the God who dwelt within it. "Thank you for hearing. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for the promise." The journey home passed more quickly than the journey to Shiloh had seemed to take. Hannah rode with a lightness of spirit that made even the physical discomforts of travel seem insignificant. She found herself humming softly as they made their way through the familiar landscapes, and when other pilgrims commented on her cheerful demeanor, she would smile mysteriously and speak of the goodness of the Lord. Back in Ramah, Hannah resumed her daily routines with renewed energy and purpose. The tasks that had once seemed burdensome now felt meaningful, as if she were preparing not just for her current life, but for the new life that was coming. She went about her work with the efficiency that impressed even the servant girls, and her improved spirits seemed to brighten the entire household. Elkanah noticed that his wife had begun to eat more heartily than she had in years, and her complexion took on a healthy glow that made her more beautiful than ever. When he commented on these changes, Hannah would simply smile and attribute them to the spiritual refreshment of their pilgrimage, but he sensed there was more to the story than she was telling. It was not long before Hannah's monthly courses failed to appear, and she knew with a certainty that went beyond physical symptoms that the Lord had indeed granted her petition. The child she had longed for, prayed for, and promised to the Lord was growing within her womb. The miracle she had barely dared to hope for was becoming reality, and every day brought new confirmation of God's faithfulness to His promises. Hannah kept the news of her pregnancy to herself for as long as possible, partly from a natural desire to protect this precious secret until it was beyond doubt, and partly from a wish to avoid Peninnah's inevitable commentary on this development. She continued her daily routines with careful attention to her growing condition, eating foods that would nourish the child within her and avoiding activities that might pose a risk to the pregnancy. When the signs of her condition became too obvious to conceal, Hannah shared the news first with Elkanah in the privacy of their sleeping chamber. He received the announcement with joy that was both profound and reverent, understanding that this was not merely a natural blessing, but a divine answer to years of faithful prayer. Together they knelt and offered thanksgiving to the Almighty, praising Him for His mercy and asking for His continued protection over mother and child. The news spread quickly through the household and then through the town of Ramah. The reactions were varied and telling. The servant girls rejoiced openly, having watched their mistress suffer for so many years and having grown to love her for her kindness and gentleness. The other women of the town offered their congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity, some genuinely happy for Hannah's blessing, and others perhaps slightly envious that her prayers had been answered while theirs remained unfulfilled. Peninnah's response was complex and difficult to read. On the surface, she offered appropriate congratulations and expressions of joy for her co-wife's condition. But Hannah could see in her eyes a mixture of emotions that included surprise, concern, and perhaps even fear. For years, Peninnah's status in the household had been secure precisely because she was the mother, while Hannah was not. Now that dynamic was about to change, and the future seemed less certain than it had before. As Hannah's pregnancy progressed, she found herself growing not only in body, but in spiritual understanding. The child within her womb was not merely the fulfillment of her personal longing, but a sacred trust from the Almighty. She had promised this child to the Lord's service before he was even conceived, and she spent long hours in prayer and meditation, preparing her heart for the sacrifice that would be required of her. The physical changes of pregnancy were welcomed joyfully by Hannah, even when they brought discomfort. The morning sickness that left her weak and nauseated was a sign that life was growing within her. The growing weight that made her movements more labored was evidence of the miracle unfolding in her body. The strange foods she suddenly craved, and the familiar foods that no longer appealed to her, were all reminders that she was no longer living for herself alone, but was nurturing another life. Elkanah was attentive and protective during his wife's pregnancy, ensuring that she had the best foods available and that her workload was reduced appropriately. He consulted with the midwives of the town about what would be needed for the birth and made sure that everything was prepared well in advance. His love for Hannah, always deep, seemed to deepen even further as he watched her body change and bloom with the life she carried. As the months passed and Hannah's condition became more advanced, she began to feel the child moving within her womb. These first movements were like butterfly wings fluttering against her heart, gentle and barely perceptible. But as the baby grew stronger, the movements became more pronounced and frequent, and Hannah would sometimes pause in her work to place her hands on her belly and marvel at the active life within her. During these quiet moments of communion with her unborn child, Hannah would speak softly to him, for she was certain the baby was a son, as she had requested in her prayer. She would tell him about the promise she had made, about the service that awaited him, about the God who had granted his existence in response to desperate prayer. She would sing to him the songs of Israel, the Psalms of David, the ancient melodies that carried the faith of their people from generation to generation. "Little one," she would whisper, her hands moving gently over her growing belly, "you are not mine to keep, though you are mine to love. You belong to the Lord who made you, and to Him you will return when you are old enough to serve in His house. But until that day comes, I will love you with all my heart and raise you to know and fear the God who answered my prayer by giving you life." The other women of Ramah, when they visited to check on Hannah's progress and offer advice about pregnancy and childbirth, were sometimes puzzled by her serene acceptance of the future separation from her child. Most mothers could barely imagine being parted from their children for a few days, let alone giving them up permanently to serve in the tabernacle. But Hannah's peace on this subject was genuine and deep-rooted, flowing from her absolute trust that God's plans were better than her own desires. As Hannah's time approached, the preparations for birth intensified. The midwives were consulted about the signs to watch for and the supplies that would be needed. A birthing chamber was prepared with clean linens and the tools necessary for delivery. The other women of the extended family began to gather, ready to assist with the birth and provide support during the vulnerable weeks that would follow. Hannah herself prepared not only physically but spiritually for the coming ordeal. Childbirth in that time and place was dangerous for both mother and child, and she knew that she was trusting her life and her baby's life to the hands of the same God who had granted this pregnancy. She spent increasing amounts of time in prayer, not asking for an easy delivery, but for the strength to endure whatever might come, and for the safe arrival of the child she had promised to dedicate to the Lord's service. When the first pains of labor began, Hannah recognized them immediately and sent word to Elkanah, who was working in the fields. He returned quickly and sent messengers to summon the midwives and the women who would assist with the birth. The household took on the hushed, expectant atmosphere that accompanies significant life events, and everyone moved with the careful efficiency of people who understood the gravity of what was taking place. Hannah's labor was long and difficult, as first births often are, but she bore the pain with a courage and patience that impressed even the experienced midwives. Between the waves of contractions, she would pray softly or sing fragments of psalms, drawing strength from her faith and from the certainty that this child was God's gift and would be born safely in His time. Elkanah waited outside the birthing chamber, pacing and praying, occasionally hearing Hannah's voice raised in pain or in prayer. The sounds of labor, the low moaning, the sharp cries, the urgent whispers of the midwives filled him with both anxiety and anticipation. He had waited so long for this moment, had watched Hannah suffer for so many years, that the reality of impending fatherhood seemed almost too wonderful to believe. As the long hours of the night passed and dawn began to break over the hills around Ramah, Hannah's labor reached its climax. With a final tremendous effort that seemed to draw upon reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, she brought her son into the world. The baby's first cry was strong and clear, a sound that brought tears of joy and relief to everyone present. "A son," the midwife announced, holding up the infant for Hannah to see. "A fine, strong son." Hannah, exhausted but triumphant, reached out to receive her child with hands that trembled from more than physical weakness. As she looked into the tiny face of her newborn son, she felt a love so overwhelming and complete that it seemed to fill her entire being. This was the child she had prayed for, waited for, promised to God before he was even conceived. This was the answer to years of desperate supplication, the proof of divine faithfulness, the miracle she had almost stopped believing could happen. "Samuel," she whispered, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead. "His name is Samuel, because I have asked for him from the Lord." The name Samuel meant "heard by God," or "God has heard," a perfect expression of the circumstances surrounding his birth and the prayer that had brought him into existence. As Hannah held her son close and felt his tiny body relax against her chest, she marveled at the goodness of God, who had not only heard her prayer, but had granted it in such abundance. Elkanah, when he was finally permitted to enter the birthing chamber and meet his son, was overwhelmed with joy and gratitude. He had longed to be a father to Hannah's child almost as much as she had longed to be a mother. And now, holding this perfect infant in his arms, he felt the completion of dreams he had barely dared to articulate. "He is beautiful," Elkanah said softly, studying every detail of his son's face. "He looks strong and healthy. Surely the Lord has blessed us beyond measure." Hannah smiled at her husband's obvious delight in their child, but even in this moment of perfect happiness, she did not forget the vow she had made. This baby boy, who had filled the empty places in her heart so completely, would not remain with her forever. She had promised him to the Lord's service, and that promise would have to be kept. But for now, while he was still too young to be separated from his mother, she would treasure every moment, memorize every expression, and pour into him all the love that had been stored up through years of waiting. The days following Samuel's birth were filled with the joys and challenges that accompany any new baby. Hannah recovered her strength gradually, tended by the women of her family and household. She nursed her son with a contentment that seemed to radiate from her entire being, and she spent long hours simply watching him sleep, marveling at the perfection of his tiny features and the miracle of his existence. Samuel proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby who ate well and grew steadily. His cries were strong when he was hungry or uncomfortable, but he also had periods of alert quiet when he would look around with dark eyes that seemed almost wise beyond his age. Hannah often felt, during these quiet moments when she held him close, that she was looking at a child who was already marked for a special destiny. The other women of Ramah came to visit the new mother and baby, bringing gifts of food and clothing and offering advice about infant care. Most of them commented on Samuel's beauty and apparent health, and many remarked on how much happiness his birth had brought to Hannah. The transformation in her demeanor was striking. Where once she had moved through life with an underlying sadness, she now radiated joy and fulfillment. Peninnah's attitude toward the new baby and his mother was complex and sometimes difficult to interpret. She offered the expected congratulations and assistance, but Hannah sensed an underlying tension that spoke of the changed dynamics within their household. Peninnah's children, who had been the only ones in the family, now had a new baby brother, who was clearly the focus of intense love and attention. The balance of power between the two wives had shifted in ways that would take time to fully understand. But Hannah was too absorbed in the joy of motherhood to worry over much about household politics. Every day brought new discoveries about her son, the way he would turn his head toward her voice, the tiny sounds he made while nursing, the expressions that flickered across his face while he slept. She sang to him constantly, soft lullabies and hymns of praise that filled their home with music and celebration. As Samuel grew from a tiny newborn into a more robust infant, Hannah began to think more seriously about the vows she had made. She had promised to give him to the Lord when he was old enough to be separated from her, but the exact timing of that separation was something she would need to consider carefully. He would need to be weaned, certainly, and old enough to understand basic instructions and care for himself to some degree. The thought of eventually parting from her son was painful, but Hannah's faith remained strong. She had asked God for this child specifically so that she could dedicate him to divine service, and she knew that keeping her vow was essential both to her integrity and to Samuel's future. God had kept his part of the bargain by granting her request. Now she must keep hers by following through on her promise. When the time came for the annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah made a decision that surprised her family. Instead of joining the journey as she had every year for as long as anyone could remember, she chose to remain home with her infant son. "I will not go up until the child is weaned," she told Elkanah when he questioned her decision. "Then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and remain there forever." Elkanah understood his wife's reasoning and supported her choice, though he was disappointed not to have her companionship during the pilgrimage. He could see that the separation from Samuel, even temporarily, would be difficult for Hannah, and he respected her desire to postpone their departure until the time was right. He also understood, perhaps better than Hannah realized, that when they did finally make that journey to Shiloh, their lives would be forever changed. So while Elkanah and Peninnah and her children made their way to the tabernacle for the annual festival, Hannah remained in Ramah with baby Samuel. She used this time alone with her son to deepen their bond and to prepare herself emotionally for the eventual separation that would come. She continued to sing to him, to tell him stories about the God he would serve, and to pray over him with a mother's fierce love and protective instinct. During the quiet hours when Samuel slept, Hannah would often find herself standing at the window of their home, looking out over the hills toward Shiloh. She would imagine the worship taking place there, the sacrifices being offered, the prayers rising like incense before the throne of the Almighty. Part of her longed to be there, participating in the communal celebration of faith, but a larger part was content to be exactly where she was, nurturing the child who would one day serve in that holy place. When Elkanah returned from the pilgrimage, he brought with him news of the tabernacle and greetings from Eli the priest, who remembered Hannah and her fervent prayer from the previous year. The old priest had asked about her and had expressed his pleasure at hearing that her petition had been granted. Eli had also mentioned that he looked forward to meeting the child who had been promised to the Lord's service, though no specific timeline had been discussed. As the seasons passed and Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Hannah savored every milestone and treasured every moment. His first smile, his first attempts to sit up, his first words, all were occasions for joy and celebration. She taught him simple songs and prayers, helped him learn to walk by holding his tiny hands, and marveled at his quick intelligence and eager curiosity about the world around him. Samuel was clearly a bright child, interested in everything around him, and quick to learn whatever his mother taught him. He seemed particularly drawn to the religious observances of their household, watching with fascination when Hannah lit the Sabbath lamps, or when Elkanah offered prayers of thanksgiving. Even as a very young child, he showed an unusual capacity for sitting still and listening when stories were told about the great deeds of God in Israel's history. Hannah made the most of these precious years, knowing that they were limited. She involved Samuel in as many of her daily activities as possible, teaching him about the plants in their garden, the stars in the sky, the customs and traditions of their people. She wanted him to have a foundation of knowledge and love that would sustain him when he could no longer be with her every day. As Samuel approached his 3rd birthday, Hannah knew that the time for weaning was drawing near. In that culture, children were typically nursed until they were 2 or 3 years old, and weaning marked a significant transition from infancy to childhood. It also marked, for Samuel, the approaching time when he would be old enough to fulfill his mother's vow and enter the service of the tabernacle. The process of weaning was gradual and gentle, with Hannah slowly reducing Samuel's dependence on nursing while increasing his consumption of solid foods. She made this transition as easy as possible for her son, introducing new foods with patience and celebrating each step toward independence. But even as she took pride in Samuel's growing maturity, Hannah felt each milestone as a step closer to their eventual separation. When Samuel was finally completely weaned, Hannah knew that the time had come to fulfill her vow. The child who had been the answer to her desperate prayers, who had filled her life with joy and purpose, who had transformed her from a woman of sorrow into a woman of praise, was now old enough to begin his service to the Lord. The promise she had made in her desperation would now be kept in her abundance, and the sacrifice she had offered in her emptiness would now be completed in her fullness. Hannah spent considerable time preparing for this final journey to Shiloh. She made new clothes for Samuel, choosing fine fabrics and taking special care with every stitch. She wanted him to appear before the Lord dressed in garments that reflected both his family's love for him and their respect for the God he would serve. She also prepared a generous offering to accompany Samuel's dedication: a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, gifts that would demonstrate the sincerity of her gratitude and the wholeness of her surrender. The night before their departure, Hannah held Samuel close and told him once again about the wonderful adventure that awaited him. She explained that he would live in the tabernacle, that he would learn to serve the great God of Israel, and that he would help Eli the priest with the important work of maintaining the holy place. She assured him that she and his father loved him deeply and that they would visit him regularly, but that his new home would be with God's people in God's house. Samuel, still very young but remarkably mature for his age, seemed to understand that something significant was happening. He listened to his mother's explanations with serious attention and asked thoughtful questions about what his new life would be like. His acceptance of the situation was both heartening and heartbreaking for Hannah, who was amazed by his resilience even as she grieved over the approaching separation. The journey to Shiloh passed in a blur of mixed emotions for Hannah. She was accompanied by Elkanah and the rest of their household, and Samuel rode most of the way in his father's arms, chattering excitedly about the sights along the road. To him, this was simply another adventure, another opportunity to learn and explore. He could not fully comprehend that this journey would end with him staying behind while his parents returned home without him. When they arrived in Shiloh and made their way to the tabernacle, Hannah felt her heart racing with anticipation and dread. This was the place where her desperate prayer had been answered, where Eli the priest had pronounced God's blessing upon her petition, where her entire life had been transformed from despair to hope. Now she was returning to complete the circle, to fulfill the vow that had made Samuel's existence possible. Eli, now even more aged, but still serving as high priest, recognized Hannah immediately when she approached with her family. His eyes moved from her face to the small boy at her side, and understanding dawned in his expression. This was the child who had been promised, the answer to the prayer he had blessed, the fulfillment of the vow that had been made in desperation and faith. "My Lord," Hannah said, approaching Eli with deep reverence, "as surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." As she spoke these words, Hannah gently guided Samuel forward to stand before the priest. The little boy looked up at Eli with curious, unafraid eyes, his small hand still clasped in his mother's. He was beautiful and well cared for, clearly loved and nurtured, yet being offered freely and completely to God's service. Eli looked down at the child with wonder and growing recognition of the significance of this moment. He had served in the tabernacle for many years and had seen many offerings and dedications, but there was something special about this situation that moved him deeply. This was not just the presentation of another Levitical child for service, but the fulfillment of a divine promise, the completion of a sacred transaction between a desperate woman and her God. "He is strong and healthy," Eli observed, placing his hand gently on Samuel's head, "and there is something in his eyes. He will serve the Lord well." Hannah nodded, tears beginning to flow despite her efforts to remain composed. "He has been dedicated to the Lord from before his birth. I have taught him what I could, but now his real education must begin. Will you care for him as if he were your own?" "He will be as my own son," Eli assured her, his voice gentle with understanding of her sacrifice. "The Lord will bless him and use him greatly. You have done a great thing in keeping your vow." The actual moment of separation was both easier and harder than Hannah had anticipated. Samuel, with the adaptability of childhood, seemed to accept the new situation readily. He allowed Eli to take his hand and lead him toward the tabernacle, turning back only once to wave at his parents. His trust and courage were remarkable, and Hannah drew strength from his example, even as her heart was breaking. Hannah and Elkanah remained in Shiloh for several days, partly to complete the ritual requirements associated with Samuel's dedication, and partly to help their son adjust to his new circumstances. They were able to visit with him daily, and Hannah was relieved to see that he was settling in well with the priests and the other young men who served in the tabernacle. Samuel seemed particularly drawn to the daily rhythms of worship and service. He watched with fascination as the priests performed their duties, asked endless questions about the sacred implements and rituals, and showed an eagerness to help in whatever small ways were appropriate for his age. Even Eli, despite his advancing years and the burdens of his office, seemed energized by the presence of this bright, devoted child. When the time finally came for Hannah and Elkanah to return to Ramah, the farewell was tender, but not traumatic. Samuel had made friends among the other young people at the tabernacle and was beginning to think of it as his home. He hugged his parents tightly and promised to be good and work hard, but he did not cry or beg to come with them. His maturity and acceptance were both a comfort and a heartache to Hannah. As their caravan pulled away from Shiloh and Samuel's small figure grew smaller in the distance, Hannah felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was grief, certainly, the deep ache of a mother separated from her child. There was also fear about his welfare and worry about whether she had made the right decision. But stronger than these negative emotions was a profound sense of completion and rightness, a peace that came from knowing she had kept her word to God and fulfilled her part of the sacred covenant that had brought Samuel into existence. The journey home to Ramah was quiet and subdued, but not sorrowful. Hannah found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her from desperate barrenness to fulfilled motherhood to sacrificial dedication. Every step had been part of God's plan. Every prayer had been heard and answered. Every promise had been kept on both sides of the divine relationship. Back in Ramah, life gradually settled into new rhythms. The house seemed strangely quiet without Samuel's voice and laughter, but Hannah did not allow herself to dwell on his absence. Instead, she threw herself into the work of preparing for their annual visits to Shiloh, when she would be reunited with her son and could see how he was growing and developing in his service to the Lord. Each year, Hannah would spend months preparing for the pilgrimage, making new clothes for Samuel, and planning special treats to bring him. These annual reunions became the highlights of her year, occasions of great joy and celebration when she could see evidence of God's blessing on her son's life and service. Samuel grew and thrived under Eli's care, developing not only physically, but spiritually and intellectually. He showed remarkable aptitude for the religious life, mastering the Psalms and prayers, learning the intricate details of ritual observance, and displaying a wisdom and maturity that impressed all who encountered him. Most remarkably, he began to demonstrate the prophetic gift, receiving communications from God that marked him as one chosen for special service. Hannah watched her son's development with pride and gratitude, seeing in his growth the vindication of her sacrifice and the fulfillment of God's promises. She had given up the daily joy of motherhood, but she had gained something even more precious, the knowledge that her child was fulfilling his divine destiny and serving the God who had made his existence possible. As Samuel matured from child to young man, his reputation for wisdom and prophetic insight spread throughout Israel. He became known as one who heard from God clearly and spoke his words faithfully, a bridge between the human and the divine that Israel desperately needed during those troubled times. His influence grew beyond the tabernacle at Shiloh to encompass the entire nation, and he became the judge and spiritual leader who would guide Israel through some of its most critical years. Hannah lived to see her son become one of the most important figures in Israel's history, a prophet whose words carried the authority of divine revelation and whose influence shaped the destiny of God's chosen people. The child she had prayed for in desperation, promised in faith, and surrendered in obedience had become the answer not only to her personal longings, but to her nation's spiritual needs. In her later years, as Hannah looked back on the remarkable journey that had begun with her barrenness and tears in the tabernacle at Shiloh, she could see clearly how God had woven together her personal pain and the nation's need into a tapestry of divine purpose. Her inability to have children had not been a cruel punishment, but a preparation for a greater calling. Her suffering had not been meaningless, but had been the crucible in which her faith was refined and her character prepared for the ultimate test of surrender. The prayer that had begun in desperation had become a song of praise that would echo through the generations. The child who had been asked for in sorrow had become a source of joy not only to his mother, but to all of Israel. The vow that had seemed impossible to keep had become the foundation of a legacy that would endure long after Hannah herself had gone to join her ancestors. As we reflect upon this remarkable story of Hannah and Samuel, we find ourselves drawn into the very heart of what it means to trust God with our deepest longings and most precious dreams. Hannah's journey from barrenness to motherhood to sacrificial surrender reveals truths about faith, prayer, and divine purpose that speak as powerfully to us today as they did to the ancient people of Israel. The story begins with a woman's pain, the profound ache of unfulfilled longing that touches so many human hearts in different ways. Hannah's barrenness was not merely a personal disappointment, but a source of social shame, family tension, and spiritual confusion. In a culture that viewed children as the clearest sign of divine blessing, her empty womb seemed to mark her as one whom God had forgotten or rejected. Yet, it was precisely this deep need, this desperate emptiness, that became the soil in which miraculous faith would grow. Hannah's response to her situation teaches us something profound about the nature of authentic prayer. She did not merely ask God for what she wanted. She poured out her soul before Him with a transparency and intensity that left her vulnerable to misunderstanding and criticism. Her prayer was not a polite request, but a desperate plea, not a careful theological statement, but a raw emotional outpouring. She held nothing back, offered everything she had, and trusted God with the deepest secrets of her heart. The transformation that occurred in Hannah between her desperate prayer and her peaceful departure from the tabernacle reveals something beautiful about how faith works. She left Shiloh with no visible change in her circumstances. She was still childless, still subject to Peninnah's taunts, still living with the daily reminders of her barrenness. Yet something fundamental had shifted within her spirit. She had moved from desperate petition to confident trust, from anxious striving to peaceful surrender. She had learned to rest in God's promise even before she could see its fulfillment. The birth of Samuel represents more than the answer to one woman's prayer. It demonstrates God's faithfulness to those who trust Him completely. The child who came in response to Hannah's petition was not merely a biological miracle, but a divine gift designed to serve purposes far greater than his mother's personal happiness. From his earliest days, Samuel was marked for special service, called to be a bridge between the human and the divine during one of Israel's most critical periods. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Hannah's story is her willing surrender of the very gift she had longed for so desperately. Having finally received the child she had prayed for, she was called to give him up, to place him in service to the God who had granted his existence. This act of sacrificial love reveals the true depth of Hannah's faith. she understood that Samuel belonged not to her, but to the Lord, and that her role was not to possess him, but to prepare him for his divine calling. The sacrifice Hannah made was not a one-time act, but a daily choice to trust God with what was most precious to her. Every day she spent with Samuel was shadowed by the knowledge that their time together was limited. Every milestone he reached brought him closer to the moment when he would leave her care for good. Yet she embraced these bittersweet years fully, pouring all her love and wisdom into the time they had together while preparing both herself and her son for the separation that would come. Hannah's willingness to keep her vow, even when it cost her everything she had gained, demonstrates a kind of integrity that goes beyond mere honesty to touch the very heart of covenant relationship with God. She had made her promise in desperation, when keeping it seemed like a small price to pay for the miracle she sought. When the time came to fulfill that promise, when she held in her arms the child she had longed for and loved beyond measure, she discovered what her words really meant. Yet she did not waver or seek to renegotiate the terms of her agreement with God. The fruit of Hannah's sacrifice was not only Samuel's remarkable ministry, but also her own spiritual growth and influence. Her song of praise, recorded in the scriptures as a testimony to God's faithfulness, became a model for worship and thanksgiving that would inspire believers for generations. Her example of faith, prayer, and sacrificial love established her as one of the great women of biblical history, a mother whose influence extended far beyond her own family to encompass the entire people of God. Samuel's development under Eli's care reveals how God honors the sacrifices made in faith. The child who was given up by his mother found in the tabernacle not deprivation, but opportunity, not abandonment, but divine calling. He grew in wisdom and stature, developing gifts and abilities that would never have emerged in an ordinary domestic setting. His separation from Hannah was not a loss, but a transformation, preparing him for a role that would affect the destiny of nations. The annual reunions between Hannah and Samuel demonstrate how God can redeem even the pain of separation when it is offered in faith. These precious times together became occasions of celebration and mutual encouragement, opportunities for Hannah to see the fruit of her sacrifice and for Samuel to receive the continued blessing of his mother's love and wisdom. Their relationship, though changed by circumstances, remained strong and meaningful throughout their lives. As Samuel matured into his prophetic calling, becoming the spiritual leader who would guide Israel through the transition from judges to kings, Hannah could see clearly how her personal sacrifice had served divine purposes far greater than her own happiness. The child she had prayed for in her desperate need had become the answer to her nation's spiritual hunger. The son she had surrendered in faithful obedience had become a channel of God's revelation and guidance for all his people. Hannah's story speaks powerfully to anyone who has ever struggled with unanswered prayer, who has wondered why God seems silent in the face of desperate need, who has questioned whether their longings and dreams matter to the Creator of the universe. Her experience demonstrates that God's timing is not our timing, that His purposes often unfold in ways we could never anticipate, and that our deepest needs are always known and remembered by our Heavenly Father. The story also challenges us to examine our own willingness to surrender our most precious gifts to God's service. It is relatively easy to offer God our excess, our leftovers, the things we can spare without significant cost to ourselves. It is far more difficult to place on the altar of sacrifice the very things we have prayed for most fervently, the dreams we have cherished most deeply, the relationships we value most highly. Yet Hannah's example suggests that it is precisely these ultimate offerings that God uses to accomplish His greatest purposes. For parents, Hannah's story offers both comfort and challenge. Her deep love for Samuel, her careful nurturing of his early development, her painful but faithful surrender of his future to God's will. All of these provide a model for how we might approach our own children as gifts entrusted to our care, rather than possessions to be controlled. Her example reminds us that our ultimate goal in parenting should not be to keep our children close to us, but to prepare them for the unique purposes God has planned for their lives. For those who struggle with infertility, loss, or other forms of unfulfilled longing, Hannah's journey offers hope without providing easy answers. Her story does not promise that all prayers will be answered as dramatically as hers was, but it does demonstrate that no sincere plea is unheard by God, that no faithful heart is forgotten, that even our deepest disappointments can be woven into patterns of meaning and purpose we could never imagine. The prophetic dimension of Hannah's story, her role in bringing forth the prophet who would anoint Israel's first kings and establish the monarchy that would culminate in the coming of the Messiah, reminds us that our individual prayers and sacrifices are part of a much larger story of God's work in the world. Hannah could not have known that her personal petition for a child would contribute to the unfolding of salvation history, but her faithfulness in the small things of her own life positioned her to play a crucial role in God's grand design. In the end, Hannah's story is a testament to the truth that God's ways are higher than our ways, His thoughts higher than our thoughts, and His purposes more wonderful than anything we could ask or imagine. It reminds us that the God who sees every tear, hears every prayer, and knows every heartache is also the God who weaves all things together for good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. As we close our meditation on this beautiful account of faith, sacrifice, and divine faithfulness, let us carry with us the memory of Hannah's courage in prayer, her integrity in keeping her promises, and her wisdom in understanding that the greatest gifts are those we place unreservedly in God's hands. May her example inspire us to bring our own deepest needs before the Lord with similar honesty and trust. And may her testimony encourage us to believe that our faithful God still hears, still remembers, and still works miracles in the lives of those who dare to hope in Him. The echo of Hannah's song of praise continues to resonate through the ages, reminding every generation that the Lord raises up the humble, strengthens the weak, and fulfills His promises to those who wait upon Him. In the quiet places of our own hearts, where our deepest longings dwell, may we hear the whisper of divine assurance that God knows, God cares, and God will surely bring to completion the good work He has begun in each of our lives. The story of Hannah and Samuel stands as an eternal testimony to the truth that no prayer offered in faith is ever wasted, no sacrifice made in love is ever forgotten, and no heart that trusts in God will ever be ultimately disappointed.